Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and it's time for another breakfast chat. And today, I'm going to answer a question I got in my comments yesterday or the day before. I thought it was an interesting question. And I don't normally like to entertain questions about, well, purely for hypertrophy. This is a strength and fitness channel. Okay. I'm not interested in helping people who only care about hypertrophy, and people don't ever really mean that. They just mean that's their primary goal. But that's a whole nother topic. I've made videos before explaining why that's a silly point. Just like me, if someone says, Jason, do you only care about strength? Well, if I only cared about strength, I would get really fat, I would bulk up to 300 pounds, and I would take as much gear as I could possibly tolerate the side effects with no concern for if I lived or died, because I only care about strength. See how silly that is? No one only cares about that. We all have multiple things we want. But the point is, he brought up the question of, well, people who are pursuing hypertrophy primarily, why wouldn't they just do full Olympic squats and leg presses and stuff to build up their quads and things? In other words, the longest range of motion possible should always produce the most hypertrophy. And so therefore, I think that they would get better size if they just did full ass to grass Olympic squats, meaning a narrow stance, leg presses, things like that, taken all the way to the furthest range of motion. They would get bigger. And the reality is that's not true. It's a nice hypothesis, but when we start talking about things like that, what we are saying is you'll probably get, if you did very, very little training, if you did one exercise and one exercise only per muscle group, and you did like 1 or 2 sets, that's it. You didn't do multiple sets. You don't do more than one exercise. In that context, taking something through its furthest possible range of motion will probably produce slightly more hypertrophy. Now, people say, but don't we have studies on this? No, we have studies on half reps. Okay. We have studies on half reps on single joint exercises, and they show consistently that when multiple 10 rep sets are taken to failure, like on a leg extension, right? Taken to the full range of motion versus set up to do half reps, because you can limit these machines. You can put stoppers in there to make it a half rep. Exactly 50% versus 100% of the terminal range of motion of the joint. Sets taken to failure for like sets of 10, the people who did the longer range of motion gained more size and more strength. They gained more size and more strength in their quadriceps. But that's not what we're talking about. First of all, we're talking about a single small exercise being done for partials compared to maybe some big exercises that involve a lot of muscles, maybe with a few degrees, 10 degrees of knee flexion removed. And that matters because when we start looking at things like joint angle specificity, what do we know? Because, here's the point. We know that there are muscle fibers associated with different joint angles, right? You have muscle fibers on any range of motion on a movement inside the muscle that moves it. We have muscle fibers that can work through the entire range of motion. They can contribute anywhere in there. And then we'll have muscle fibers at certain points through the muscle that work at relatively small joint angles. So in other words, the bottom versus the top of the rep, you may have muscle fibers that only get recruited near the bottom and some that only get recruited near the top. Those are going to constitute a smaller number of your muscle fibers. But we know that's the reason that joint angle specificity matters. That's why strength gains, when we start going over to partial reps, only transfer about 15 degrees further than what you trained, because of the different muscle fibers involved. So you take something like a squat. People say, well, on a power squat, the quad might not get worked as much because there's going to be, 10 degrees, 5 degrees difference in the joint angle at the knee, at the bottom. It might not get stretched as deep compared to a full ass to grass squat. And that's true. But here's the thing. It's pretty close. You're not losing like half of the range of motion. You're losing degrees. What are you losing, what, 5%? Maybe 10% when you go to a wide stance power squat. All right, here's the issue with that though. Talking about just the quadriceps and maybe the glutes. What about all the other muscles that it brings in? Okay, an Olympic squat done in that manner, for example, uses less adductor, less abductor, right? All the muscles of your hips get used less. The difference in quad size is probably negligible to very small. Now, the research that's looked at this at stance width, because again, stance width is what affects this actually, doesn't seem to cause less activation of the quad. This has been studied. But what we are getting is a lot more other muscles brought in. So from a total hypertrophy perspective, we could argue that the wider stance power squat builds more muscle. Builds more muscle. Yes, it does slightly reduce range of motion, but we can usually do more weight and we involve more muscles. More total hypertrophy. It gets further complicated when we start saying, well, again, some of these differences are only in a very low volume, very low exercise selection scenario. What happens when you start doing multiple exercises? Okay, what happens when you add a belt squat and a good morning? You see where we're going here? Belt squat, we're now adding an additional quad exercise. It's going to have slightly different angles. Good mornings are going to work the quads, not as much as a squat, but they're more just the top because there's only a partial bend to the knee. Your deadlifts start working the quads, particularly a sumo. Multiple exercises added in for multiple sets start to bring these differences down. And then we start getting more into, hey, if we're doing multiple lifts and some of them do put more focus slightly on different parts of the range of motion, we come back over to that other point about the joint angle specificity and the muscle fiber specific to that. When multiple exercises come into the mix, we're getting a more thorough working of the muscle anyways. This is why we know that research has found that when you do more than one exercise for a muscle, it usually produces superior hypertrophy. These differences start to disappear. You know, it's like we can argue about, well, maybe the chest can't be fully developed with a bench press. Okay, great. So what happens if you do 3 really hard sets of bench press and then 3 really hard sets of incline bench? Well, now that's a different ball game, isn't it? We've now added a different exercise that puts a different emphasis on different parts of the chest. And then here's the other thing. When we start adding multiple big exercises, just like I mentioned a minute ago, we could talk about a squat, but what happens when we add another exercise? What happens when we add a belt squat? What happens when we add a good morning? They start putting more specialized focus into these different muscles the squat is hitting, and now we're hitting them from different angles. Our total hypertrophic potential starts going up. It starts going up quickly, and that's the other thing. You know, let's say you're doing a couple exercises for a muscle, big movements, and one of them doesn't take it through the full range of motion, but another one does. But the other one might be hitting the 2/3 of the range of motion that does get used, hitting those muscle fibers very hard through there, and then the other one picks up the rest. So when we start getting rid of the minimalist mindset, these differences in perceived hypertrophy potential start to go away. And again, what happens when they're big movements that are having a large splash over through the whole body? Again, talking about the entire lower body, not just the quads. Well, when you start doing a power squat or a box squat, but then you add a belt squat to it with a wide stance, now we're dealing with a whole lot more muscles. You throw in the good morning and you look at all the musculature of the back that gets worked on the squat. A lot of it gets worked harder on that exercise. Whereas in, say, the belt squat, it's all lower body. All of this stuff starts to accumulate, all the muscles of the back, all the muscles involving hip extension, all of the muscles involving knee extension. We're getting a more varied response. And when each exercise is done for multiple sets of hard sets, limit sets, not where you're just doing just junk volume, but actual hard sets, again, these differences between those few degrees of joint angle that are occurring on a range of motion start to matter a lot less in this context. And what you find, people say, well, wouldn't you build bigger quads with the other one? Well, I'm talking about building muscle through the whole body. But arguably, no, because now we're doing multiple exercises that are taking the joint through the vast majority of its range of motion, and we're hitting everything from multiple angles. So no, you probably wouldn't if these are hard limit sets that are hitting all the available muscle fibers. No, I really don't think you will. And I mean, look at my quads, look at the quads of some of my clients, guys like Mike. We all have big quads. Are we doing any of the things that the person asked about? No, we all have massive quads because we do a lot of squatting. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.